I am here with Dr. Jeremy Goodman, who is a philosophy professor at the University of Southern California. Thanks so much, Dr. Goodman, for joining us.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
I want you to tell me about beliefs and other things that we can do with our minds. But like if you think something or you believe something or you know something, like obviously belief has its own words. So what is that idea?
Yeah, so um, I think the word believe and the word think mean very close to the same thing in the way people ordinarily talk, although there's some differences in connotation. So people say they believe in God or use the word believe to talk about um, moral principles or political views that are really important to them and really central to their worldview. Um, and when I'm going to be talking about what people believe today, I don't want to just be focusing on like moral beliefs or religious beliefs or things like that, but just totally ordinary beliefs. Like I believe that I'm holding a can of seltzer. Um, and as a sort of basic heuristic for the kind of notion of belief that I'm thinking about, they're the kinds of things that um, we say when we're being sincere. Or if you say something and I believe you, then the thing you said is something I believe. So maybe there are other ways of having beliefs. Maybe there's a whole different part of the mind, the unconscious, and we can have beliefs in an unconscious way. Those are really cool, deep questions. But for the purposes of our conversation today, we don't need to think about those kinds of beliefs. If there are kinds of beliefs like that, we can just look at the pretty on the surface beliefs of the kinds of things we tell each other when we're being sincere.
So if while we were recording this, your really funny partner came in and swapped your can with a totally different can, say they swapped it with a bubbly, and you grab your drink and you're talking to me and you still think to yourself like, I believe I'm holding a can of seltzer, but you would be wrong because unbeknownst to you somebody swapped out your drink, haha. So you can be wrong about what you believe. Like, can you tell me about how that's possible that you can have false beliefs?
Yeah. So that's one of the big differences between believing something versus knowing it. Um, you can't, uh, sometimes we talk maybe in a loose or metaphorical way about knowing things that aren't true, but that's sort of, you think you know it, but you don't know it if it's not true. Um, as you were pointing out, though, it's totally possible to end up believing things that are false. Um, and I just want to say one clarification thing about that. You also described it as a belief that's wrong. I believed the wrong thing. And there's an obvious sense in which that's true. But there's another sense in which you might think, well, given what I had to go on, given my evidence, if I, you know, started off with what is this? The polar seltzer, caffeine free, and then got swapped with the bubbly, and I wasn't paying attention, then it would be totally reasonable, sorry, for me to think that I was drinking the polar 100% natural seltzer. So a reasonable belief can still be a false belief. And a belief is false, that's just to say that the content of the belief isn't true. So my belief that I'm drinking the polar seltzer, the content of that is just the claim that I'm drinking the polar seltzer. And if I hadn't been drinking the polar seltzer, then that content would have been false. So the belief would have been false.
Wow, that's so interesting. So is it like there's this one thing that we do in our minds, and that's belief. And your beliefs can be false, or your beliefs can be true. Or is it like there are true beliefs, one kind of thing, and there are false beliefs, another kind of thing? Does it matter if belief is like one thing that could be true or false, or are those
Yeah,
the
that,
same?
that's an interesting question. And it can certainly matter for a lot of different purposes. So if you're interested in like, what are the nature of mental states, and should we think that um, when you get something wrong versus when you get it right, and you're believe truly or believe falsely, that those are actually very different kinds of mental states that you could be in. I don't know how to think about that question. A lot of philosophers have written different things about it, and I think it's an interesting question. Um, I don't think that's a question that needs to be answered, though, in order to engage with the kinds of questions I think we're going to talk about today, which is just sort of looking at the kinds of patterns of beliefs you can have in terms of whether they're true or false. And lets us set aside the question of like, well, are the true ones in some sense a different kind of psychological state than the false ones? Although
Okay.
that's definitely an interesting question.
Totally out the window then. So we've got true beliefs, false beliefs, consistent beliefs, inconsistent beliefs. Can you tell me what exactly it means to have one of these? Like inconsistent belief, what is that?
Yeah. So um, the way I'm going to understand it is the following way. So unlike a true belief or a false belief, that's a single belief. When I talk about inconsistent beliefs, that's a property of a collection of beliefs. And let's just focus on the totality of things that a person believes. So here's what I'm going to mean by beliefs being consistent, and then they're inconsistent just in case they're not consistent. So your beliefs are consistent if you think of the things you believe as just like a bag of claims. So I believe I'm in Los Angeles, that's one claim in the bag. I believe I'm drinking seltzer, that's another claim in the bag. I believe my name's Jeremy, that's another claim in the bag, etc. Um, that collection of claims, that bag of claims is consistent if you could imagine just some possible circumstance, it doesn't have to be the actual circumstance, um, where every one of those claims is true. So if I can just specify a possibility where going through the list, everything that's on the list is true in that possible circumstance, then the list is a consistent collection of claims. And if that list is the list of exactly the things that I believe, then my beliefs are consistent. On the other hand, if you took all the things that I believed and it was impossible to find a possibility where they were all true, then that would mean that that collection of claims was inconsistent, and so my beliefs were inconsistent. An example of that would be, say, if I believed that it was going to rain really hard tomorrow, and I also believed that it wasn't going to rain at all tomorrow. So that's an impossible, it's impossible that both of those things be true. So since both of those things are things I believe, it's impossible that the collection of things, which are the things I believe, all be true in any circumstance. So my beliefs are inconsistent in that sense.
Okay, would you call it inconsistent or consistent if I believed a lot of false things? So I've got all these beliefs and they're all false, but they go together. So how do you come down on that?
Yeah. So as you as you put it, going together, one way of making that precise is just to say, in some sense, that it's consistent, and to say that you could specify a scenario where they would all be true. So that would be a way in which, although my beliefs are false, they could still be consistent. So a very simple example of that would be, um, imagine I just had one belief, and the only thing I believed was that I was holding a can of bubbly. So um, that's false, because the circumstance I'm actually in isn't one where that claim is true. But there are other possible circumstances, totally coherent possibilities, one where I am drinking bubbly. So that would be a situation where the entire list, which only has one thing on it, so the one claim on the list is true, and that would show that that one item list is a consistent list. And so if that were the only thing I believed, then my beliefs would be consistent. So of course, it's ridiculous to assume that that's the only thing I believed. I mean, maybe it's not even possible for anyone to just believe that one thing. But the general point is that just because you're mistaken in your kind of outlook on the world doesn't mean that there's any kind of incoherence in your outlook on the world. It just means that the possibilities which are compatible with the way you think the world is don't actually include the way the world actually is, but only include non-actual possibilities.
Wow, that's subtle and interesting. Okay, so you have some belief, you believe whatever it is, and somebody else thinks that your belief is false. So sometimes it happens where we say that, oh, they have a false belief. I'm wondering though, if you're thinking about your own state of mind as including a false belief. So if you thought, for example, I believe that I have a false belief, is that even possible?
I think it's possible, and I think it's kind of required for people like us. It would be really immodest and kind of, I think, ridiculous for any real life person not to think that they were wrong about something, not to think that they had a false belief. Um, because there's so many occasions where we can go wrong. And sometimes we go wrong because we've made a mistake, like if you're doing a calculation and you make an error in the calculation. But other times you can go wrong and it's not your fault. It's actually you being entirely reasonable. So it's not just that I would not be at fault if, while my eyes were closed, someone replaced my soda with a different soda. It would be entirely rational and appropriate for me to continue thinking that I was drinking the polar seltzer. It would, in fact, maybe be required for me to keep thinking that because that's what's supported by the my evidence that I happen to have, at least on a natural way of thinking about what your evidence is. Other ways in which you can be mistaken are if, unbeknownst to you, you're suffering a little bit of a visual illusion. So maybe if you have like a little cut in your eye, things will look a little pink. So you look at a white thing and you believe that it's pink. Sorry for the gross example. I actually have this not when I'm just lying on my side in a certain kind of way. The colors look a bit different. And sometimes I don't notice that. I think, oh, why is that white wall looking a little bit blue? Anyway, that's a way you could make a mistake if you didn't know that was going on, or you
But
could
you know,
misremember something.
like when you're
Sorry.
laying there, you see this weird color and you know it's because you're laying in this funny way.
Yeah. So that would be maybe not the best example because there, although it looks a certain way, since you know what's going on, you wouldn't actually believe that it's that way. But it could also happen that you don't actually know that there's something atypical going on with your eyes, and you think, oh, maybe, or and it's not a familiar, say, surface or object that you're looking at, and then you would just misjudge its color. But that would be an entirely reasonable thing for you to do. Other ways in which you can sort of reasonably end up having false beliefs are if you misremember things. Um, our memory is imperfect, but that's just how it is. And I take it we all have some seeming memories of things which actually aren't true, at least not in all of their details. So they involve some false beliefs. And also when we're misinformed. So people who we have every reason to believe are telling the truth and maybe who are honest and highly reliable, they'll nevertheless make mistakes sometimes or be misinformed themselves or make errors in calculation. And the things they'll tell us will be false. Nevertheless, it'll be reasonable for us to believe them. And so when we believe the things that we're told, we'll end up believing falsehoods as well. So given the fact that we have so many opportunities throughout our lives for one of those kinds of things to happen to us, that I think it's just kind of absurd to think that, oh, it's never happened. Or at least it isn't happening right now. Maybe I've had a lot of false beliefs in the past and I've been called on it, but you know, that's the past. And current me is perfect, 100% track record on my beliefs. That's I think kind of ridiculous, and it wouldn't just be ridiculous for me because I'm especially prone to these things. I think it would be ridiculous for anyone. So I think we all know that we're wrong about some things. We have some false beliefs.
So it sounds like it's reasonable for us to have false beliefs, and it's reasonable for us to admit that we have false beliefs. It probably takes like courage or something to admit it. Um, but I'm wondering if you're reflecting about yourself and the way you see the world, and you admit that you have false beliefs, but you believe that you have false beliefs. Like, is that somehow inconsistent itself to have a belief that your belief is false?
I don't think it's inconsistent, but it can feel inconsistent. And there are two different ways in which it can feel inconsistent. Um, one is by thinking about certain sorts of examples that might make you want to say that you have false beliefs or that where a certain kind of person could end up believing they have false beliefs and then thinking that in those examples, people also have inconsistent beliefs and that the inconsistency has something to do with the thinking that you have false beliefs. Maybe we can talk about that a bit later. But a different way of having a feeling that this involves inconsistent beliefs is the following thought. So if your beliefs are inconsistent, then one of them has to be false because there's no circumstance where they're all true. So in particular, the actual circumstance isn't one where they're all true. So being such that inevitably your beliefs are such that at least one of them is false, that can feel like sort of the same thing as inconsistency. And if you believe you have a false belief, well, then definitely one of your beliefs has to be false because there are two options. Take that particular belief, your belief that you have a false belief. Is it true or is it false? Well, if it's false, well, then actually it would have to be true because that's what it says. It says that you have a false belief, and that would be a false belief. Okay, so it can't be false, so it's true. But if it's true, what it says is that you have a false belief. So there's just a proof that if you believe that you have a false belief, you have to have a false belief. It doesn't tell you what that belief is. In fact, it's a bit mysterious because we know it can't be that very belief. So you get this, there are all sorts of puzzles about that. Like, wait, this is something you couldn't just believe it, because if you believed it, it would be true, but something else you believed would have to be false. Nevertheless, I think in the case of real people, that's not puzzling at all because we don't just believe one thing, let alone the one thing being that we have a false belief. So this is a kind of thing where if you believe it, then you have to have a false belief. And that inevitability of being wrong about something can feel like the same thing as inconsistency, because if your beliefs are inconsistent, then the package of beliefs inevitably includes a falsehood. But it turns out that those are actually different kinds of things. So you can show, you can build a mathematical model of a person who believes that that they have a false belief, but nevertheless their beliefs are consistent. So you can find a possible situation where everything on the list of things that they actually believe is true. So that'll be a situation where they do have a false belief, because in the actual situation, they believe they have a false belief. So that's on the list. So I want to maybe pause on that and go slowly through it, because I think having the list over here and the possibility over there is a helpful picture for how to think about what it means for these things to be consistent. It helps, and also in thinking about other sorts of examples. So you've got a list of a bunch of things you believe. One of the things on the list is that you believe you have a false belief. And for your beliefs to be consistent, then there has to be some possibility where everything on this list is true. So we've got a possibility where you do have a false belief, because one of the things on this list is that you have a false belief. You've got to also believe everything else that's on this list. But another thing on the list could be that Los Angeles is the capital of California. Suppose I believed that. Then that's on the list. Then it would have to be true over here. But yeah, that could be true in some other possible circumstance, not in the actual circumstance. Yeah. That's a good bag of beliefs. And so once we start thinking about consistency in that kind of, well, let's just list all the claims and see if we can show that it's impossible for all of the claims I believe to be true in some possible situation, no impossibility really arises. So you need to find a possible situation where you believe something false, and all the other things you actually believe are true, but just listing those claims. This is a situation where you believe something false, and also maybe you believe that, you know, any old false thing could be a thing which is true over here. You're not going to get an inconsistency out of that. So the kind of inevitability of having a false belief is real and puzzling in some ways, but it's not the same kind of inevitability of having a false belief that inconsistency is. So just at a purely like formal logic level, you can't derive that someone has inconsistent beliefs from the mere fact that they're modest, from the mere fact that they believe that they have a false belief.
So you can believe that you have a false belief and have only consistent beliefs. So in
Yeah,
other words, you're saying that believing that you have a false belief does not require inconsistency in your believing.
that's right. You need to add some other assumptions about the structure of what people believe in order for it to um, require having inconsistent beliefs in order to be modest, to believe you have false beliefs.
So here's this list of these things that this person believes. They believe that they're cool, but they also believe that they're a loser. They believe that math is hard, that science is fun. And those two highlighted beliefs, that they're a loser and that they're cool, you're saying that's inconsistent because they don't match. You can't be cool and a loser. They could also believe that they have a false belief. It's not saying like which one. And this is totally fine. Something has to be false that they believe, and that's okay. That's totally reasonable to believe that you have a false belief, and you're still not necessarily holding an inconsistent belief, although this person is.
That's right.
Okay, interesting. So why would it matter if we have inconsistent beliefs or not?
That's a good question. Um, there are different reasons philosophers have cared about that question. One is thinking about how good certain kinds of models or theories of what people believe could be. So there are certain ways of thinking about what it takes to believe something, or at least what a reasonable person will believe in the structure of their beliefs, that entail that people don't have inconsistent beliefs. So if it turned out that people do have inconsistent beliefs, then that's a real problem for those models, or at least maybe those models involve some kind of idealization. But if it turns out that like the idealization isn't enough to sort of set aside the thing which is causing ordinary people to have inconsistent beliefs, then it's not a good theory. And even if it is setting it aside, you might think, well, you're setting aside a really important part of human psychology, so you're not actually talking about real people. A different reason it might be interesting to think about inconsistent beliefs is, your listeners might have heard that anything follows from a contradiction. So if you have a bunch of inconsistent beliefs and then you take things you believe and you just derive conclusions from them, then you could derive anything. So for example, suppose I think it's going to rain hard tomorrow and I think it's not going to rain tomorrow. Then I could reason like this. Like, well, it's going to rain hard tomorrow. So, well, then either it's going to rain hard tomorrow or Santa Claus exists, because, well, the first thing is true. So obviously the one or the other is true. But it's not going to rain tomorrow. But wait, if it's not going to rain, but it's either going to rain hard or Santa Claus exists, well, then not the first one. So got to be the second one. So Santa Claus exists. So that's a absurd argument. I mean, because it's gotten to an absurd conclusion, but every step of the argument was following the rules of logic. And the way in which we could get to an absurd conclusion is if you start off with an inconsistent collection of assumptions or inconsistent collection of premises, then you can get anything you want. So if there are two different kinds of questions here, one of them descriptive, just about what people do believe and how people do reason, and the other normative, how people ought to, or what is rational for them to believe and how it's rational for them to reason. So descriptively, you might think if people have inconsistent beliefs, then assuming people just draw out the logical consequences of things they believe, shouldn't people end up just believing all sorts of absurd things just by happenstance, by going through the motions like I just went through the motions? And if not, what is it about the structure of the mind that sort of keeps the inconsistencies from generating all those kinds of absurd conclusions? Normatively, you could say, well, if it's okay to have inconsistent beliefs, then in some sense, it can't be okay to always draw out the conclusions, the consequences of things you believe using deductive logic. Because if it were okay to start off in an inconsistent place and okay to go through logic from where you start off, assuming where you start off is okay, then it would be okay to end up with absurd beliefs like that. Well, false beliefs. Santa Claus exists. If you don't think that's absurd, plug in something else which you think is absurd. So I think those two questions are actually quite different, but both of them are interesting. And those are some of the reasons I'm interested and other people have been interested in thinking about whether we do and whether we should have inconsistent beliefs.
And those questions aside, you've already shown us that believing that you have a false belief is not an inconsistent belief anyway.
Yeah, not by itself.
Okay, excellent. So on this topic of inconsistent beliefs, is there anything that we've left out that we need to add?
I would add just a last thing on the way you were setting it up. So when you had the I'm cool, I'm a loser pair of beliefs, or when I had the it's going to rain hard tomorrow and it's not going to rain tomorrow pair of beliefs, that's an inconsistency involving just two beliefs. And it's not a subtle inconsistency. It kind of hits you in the face. And while maybe there are some circumstances where people sort of explicitly hold in mind a pair of beliefs which are inconsistent in that way, that's not the kind of pattern of inconsistent beliefs that philosophers have been most interested in, or that seems most plausible. So seemingly much more likely are cases where you have an inconsistency that's spread across a lot of different beliefs. So maybe you can't actually appreciate that a large collection of things that you believe are inconsistent because you haven't held them all in mind at once or appreciated all the logical interconnections between them. Or a different way, some philosophers have thought about this in connection to the question of whether it's okay to have inconsistent beliefs, is the idea that there's a connection between what it's okay to believe and probability. So say if you thought something had at least 99% probability, then it would be okay to believe it. So that's not a view that I happen to accept myself, but many philosophers are attracted to that kind of picture about what it's rational to believe. And if you had that kind of picture, suppose you were about to roll a 100-sided die, then, well, there's at least 99% chance that it's not going to land one, at least a 99% chance it's not going to land two, et cetera, et cetera. So for each one of those claims, then the idea would be it's rational to believe it. So it's rational to believe not one, rational to believe not two, rational to believe not three. But of course, there's a 100% chance that it's going to be either one or two or three or blah, 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 up to 100. So then you've got a collection of 101 beliefs, which are inconsistent. So for each number between 1 and 100, you believe that it's not going to land on that side. And then you also have the belief that it's going to land on one or the other of those. So that would be a case where it would be okay, according to this theory, to have inconsistent beliefs, but it would never be okay to have a pair of beliefs which are inconsistent. It would have to be spread over about 100 beliefs in order for your beliefs to be inconsistent in that kind of way. So I think in thinking about the psychology of these things and also about the normative questions about what's rational, it's important to keep in mind that it's really that kind of diffuse inconsistency that we're interested in.